Hello, everybody. Bienvenue à toutes et tous. My name is Michelle MacArthur, and I'm thrilled to welcome you here to the Siminovitch Forum. For those of you who don't know me, I'm assistant professor at the University of Windsor's School of Dramatic Art. My research focuses on feminist theater and equity in theater, and I am the author of the most recent national study of gender equity in Canadian theater, published in 2015. Today's event is being simultaneously interpreted into French. If you would like to hear this evening's conversation en français, click the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and then choose French. For those of you who might not have been familiar with the Saminovich Prize, it is Canada's top theatre honor and nurtures innovation and excellence with annual prizes totaling $120,000. It was established in 2000 to honor Lou and Eleanor Siminovitch, who you will hear more about near the end of the event. Over the past 2 decades, the Saminovich Prize has transformed the lives of recipients who have then gone on to inspire peers, mentor the next generation, lead influential institutions, and create unforgettable theater. We hope you will join us throughout the year for more conversations like we are having tonight with some of Canada's most innovative theater artists. I would like to begin this evening by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We are privileged today to be able to enjoy the benefits of the land which supports all we do. Turtle Island has always been a fertile place for plants, for trees, for animals, for birds, for water, and for culture and creativity. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home, and recognize them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. Today, as we explore the topic feminist theater, we recognize the Indigenous peoples as the first storytellers on this land and pay our respects to the elders, past and present, and the essential tradition of oral history. Thank you to the people on whose territory we are able to live and thrive. We pledge to turn our acknowledgement into action to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration, and to be partners in the care of the land, water, and all who live here. We're going to start off this event with opening remarks from Pol Pelletier. Pol is an actor, creator, director, playwright, and pioneer of the feminist theater movement in Quebec and in Canada, with nearly 50 years of experience. She co-founded the Théâtre expérimental des femmes in 1979 and has gone on to found and co-found 6 other theater companies. Pol has developed a unique approach to acting and performance called the Dojo Method that she continues to teach. The remarks will be in French with English subtitles and will last approximately 7 minutes. Here is Pol Pelletier.
Et la joie qu'elle a poussée par son sourire me transperce et rejaillit au fond de moi.
C'est le 8 mars. Je pousse un cri d'alarme et peut-être un cri de ralliement. J'ai passé ma vie à réfléchir à qu'est-ce que le féminin et qu'est-ce que l'art, à quoi servent ces choses dans une société. À quoi ça sert en ce moment? Ouais. Permettez-moi de vous raconter une autre histoire de terreur, celle qui s'est abattue sur le féminisme au Québec et qui l'a tué. Je pense que c'est un continuum de terreur. Les femmes qui ont été massacrées en 1989, qui continuent aujourd'hui et qui a aggravé une espèce d'esclavage, de mutisme, de peur, de perte de parole de plus en plus grande. Alors, j'imagine qu'on m'a présenté tantôt, là, je viens du féminisme radical des années 70-80, qui a donné naissance à une création et à une liberté inimaginable aujourd'hui. Je ne peux pas croire que dans la même vie, J'ai connu ça. J'ai connu ces deux états-là. Et si vous n'étiez pas là vivant à cette époque-là, c'est impossible d'imaginer la liberté que nous avions. Alors, je suis l'idéatrice du premier théâtre de femmes au Canada qui avait pignon sur rue, une vieille maison historique dans le Vieux-Montréal. Oh mon Dieu, les théâtres à cette époque-là, messieurs, dames. Un théâtre que j'ai cofondé avec deux autres camarades femmes, le théâtre expérimental des femmes. Ce théâtre est disparu en 1990. Donc, il a duré à peu près 10 ans. Ça a l'air que dans l'histoire de l'humanité, les révolutions pures, j'ai max 10 ans. Pourquoi? C'est le temps d'aller voir. Pourquoi? Pourquoi? À peine un an après le massacre de 14 femmes à Polytechnique à Montréal, le théâtre a changé de nom, a arrêté sa vocation artistique, s'est mis à monter des textes d'auteurs hommes, avec des metteurs en scène hommes, avec des distributions parfois majoritairement et exclusivement masculines. C'est revenu tout en quasiment une seconde. J'imagine que je m'adresse à des gens du Canada, du Québec, donc vous savez sans doute qu'en 1989, un homme armé et habillé comme un soldat est entré dans l'école polytechnique de l'Université de Montréal en plein après-midi et a assassiné 14 femmes, 13 étudiantes et une employée de l'université. Après ça, c'était fini. La parole des femmes, la pensée des femmes, le théâtre des femmes. 14 femmes, est-ce que vous vous rendez compte? Pour un petit peuple comme le Québec, c'est trop, c'est énorme, nous ne nous en remettrons jamais. C'est lié aussi à l'état dans lequel on est en ce moment. L'identité québécoise est totalement liée au féminin. Le Québec est une sacrificielle. Mais c'est ici, paradoxalement, qu'adviendra un monde infusé de féminin. Plus d'État, plus de frontières, plus de chefs, plus d'armée, plus de police. Ça va être ici. Après une terrible agonie. Ouh! Attachons nos tucs. Ma philosophie du féminin décrit 3 caractéristiques qui pourraient apporter des grands changements dans notre humanité. Alors je vais essayer de faire ça bref. À gauche, vous allez... de ce côté-là de l'écran, OK? Vous allez imaginer le tableau du patriarcat. Le patriarcat, pour moi, se caractérise par 3 choses. La force, nous l'avons en pleine face, c'est toute l'histoire de l'humanité, c'est des bains de sang. Les puissants se lèvent et tuent. La force, c'est le seul argument dans l'histoire de l'humanité qui règle les conflits. Comment ça se fait qu'on n'a pas trouvé autre chose? Est-ce que le féminin pourrait aider? Ah! La force! Boum! Deuxièmement, la raison. OK, ça, qui donne des ordres à tout le reste, qui est un peu mystérieux et dérangeant. La raison, 1 + 1 = 2. Et troisièmement, la performance. Monde extérieur. Impressionné. En face de ce tableau du patriarcat des 3 caractéristiques, j'ai identifié 3 caractéristiques de ce que j'appelle, moi, le féminin. Premièrement, en face de la force, la fragilité. Admettre non seulement la fragilité, mais l'amour. J'aime ma fragilité. J'ai la seule affaire. Aimer ça, le fragile, le délicat, les bébés, les chatons, les petites fleurs. À l'intérieur de chaque être humain, ça. C'est la seule affaire qui permet la férocité. Comme la maman ours a tué, sans trouble intérieur, ce qui va enlever la vie à ces oursonnes et ces oursons. C'est pas la même chose que la force qui écrase pour dominer. Ce rapport dominant-dominé, quand est-ce, comment, regardez dans la tête. La férocité tue pas pour avoir du pouvoir, elles su pour protéger la vie. En ce moment, protéger, comment on fait ça? Deuxièmement, face à la raison, l'inconscient. Alors, c'est mon grand outil, c'est ce que j'ai découvert à travers toutes mes années de recherche et d'enseignement, l'inconscient. 90% de ce que je fais, de ce que je pense, de ce que je dis, vient d'un endroit que je ne connais pas. Il faut avoir des outils pour entrer dans ce trésor. Ouh, le corps, l'émotion, l'intuition. Une fontaine. C'est là qu'on va la trouver, la solution en ce moment, messieurs, dames. Il faut écouter dans les profondeurs. Chacun, chacune. Ça ne sera pas rationnel, la solution. Il faut arrêter. Et troisièmement, en face de la performance, la souffrance. Le féminin, c'est la souffrance. C'est ça. Ce sont les femmes qui portent la souffrance de l'humanité.
I want to thank Pol Pelletier for sharing some of her thoughts with us. She begins her remarks by asking, what is the feminine, what is feminism, and what is art? What do these things serve in a society? We will be addressing these very questions this evening with our panelists. We hope that by coming together and sharing our perspectives, that we may all be able to have some of our ideas shifted. Now, without further ado, I want to introduce you to our speakers this evening. With a string of firsts in Asian Canadian theater, Nina Lee Aquino was the founding artistic director of Fujian Asian Canadian Theater Company, organized the first Asian Canadian Theater Conference, edited the first 2-volume Asian Canadian play anthology, and co-edited the first award-winning book on Asian Canadian theater. She became artistic director of Cahoots Theater, currently holds the same position at Factory Theater, and is the incoming artistic director of the National Arts Centre English Theatre. Nina also serves as the president of the Professional Association of Canadian Theatres. Welcome, Nina. Next, I'd like to introduce Kelly Thornton. Kelly Thornton was appointed artistic director of the Royal Manitoba Arts Theatre Centre in 2019, became the first female to take on this role in the company's 62-year history. Prior to joining the MTC, Kelly led Nightwood Theatre in Toronto, where her legacy is one of provocative and inclusive programming, demonstrated consistently over 18 years under her leadership. She also brings an extensive track record in developing and premiering a multitude of new Canadian plays, including a substantial number of world premieres for first-time playwrights, several of whom received Governor General's Awards nominations. Welcome, Kelly. Next, I'd like to introduce Alex Cameron. Alex Cameron is a theater artist, musician, and performer from Toronto. She has performed and collaborated with theater companies and artistic organizations such as Nightwood Theatre through the Innovators Program, Paprika Festival in the Sound Design Lab, the Toronto Fringe, Crane Creations Theatre Company, Theatre Gargantua, Blackwood Gallery, and the Power Plant. Welcome, Alex. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Erin Shields. Erin Shields is a Canadian playwright based in Montreal. Much of her work highlights the negation or misrepresentation of women in classical texts by adapting these stories through an intersectional feminist lens for a contemporary audience. Erin's adaptation of Paradise Lost premiered at the Stratford Festival of Canada and won the Quebec Writers' Federation Prize for Playwriting. Erin also won the 2011 Governor General's Award for her play, If We Were Birds. Upcoming productions include Jane Eyre at the Citadel Theatre and Queen Goneril at Soulpepper Theatre. Welcome, Erin. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I feel it's such an honor to be moderating this panel. So I thought I'd start out with maybe a big question about the theme of today's discussion, and that is the idea of feminism and feminist theater. So I'm wondering if you could each maybe talk about how you define feminism and what makes something a feminist piece of theater. And maybe I'll pick on Alex to start, only because Alex, you gave such a, I thought, great definition in your video that was shared on social media.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to kick things off here. Yeah, to me, feminism it's a philosophy, it's a way of thinking. And a big part of that is really like structural. I think that feminist theater is not strictly about, literally making theater that deals with feminist themes, but I think it's an approach to making theater as well. It's an approach that involves questioning the typical structures and hierarchies of not only the theatrical world, but the world we live in. And the world we live in is dominated really not only by patriarchy, but by capitalism. And really those two go hand in hand, I feel. A lot of the elements of patriarchy and toxic masculinity, things like that, are things that are actively encouraged and normalized in society by capitalism. So I think it's really key for feminism to be inclusive, intersectional, always questioning, curious. And I think that it's a lens through which you view the world and produce your creations and interact and engage with your community and the people around you.
Thank you, Alex. So would anyone else like to share their thoughts on that, either how you understand feminism or what makes something feminist theater? Kelly, go ahead. Thank you.
Sure. I'm unmuted. Yeah, I think it's about disrupting the narrative. I think inherently we are fed a narrative that is dominated by the patriarchy and often don't even really know it. I mean, from the studies that we've done, and I know you've led them, Michelle, on theater and who's in the theater, who are the primary ticket buyers. Women are the primary ticket buyers, and yet there's a long series of studies from Rina Fraticelli to yours that the narrative is still dominated by patriarchal structures. And so yeah, I think inherently it's art is activism. It's about disrupting the narrative through the feminist lens, through a feminine lens. Yeah, and I totally agree with Alex that it doesn't necessarily have to be a story of a heroic woman, but it is about disrupting that narrative that we're fed, and that's the root. That's the essence of what I think feminist theater is.
Thank you. Erin or Nina, would either of you like to Erin, go ahead.
Both of you gave such great answers. Really hard to follow.
I know, ditto.
Yes, I think it's a way of working. Yes, I think it's about disrupting the narrative. And it's also about questioning the authority of the systems and the narratives that we have inherited. So in my work, I'm quite obsessed with with adapting classical texts. In part, that's because I'm really drawn to these classical texts and these voices of the past that were, had the privilege to be heard, and like Shakespeare or Milton or all those dudes who wrote the Bible, like they've captured our imaginations so much so that it is in the subconscious. I don't remember hearing for the first time the story of Adam and Eve. It feels like I've always known that story, and yet it is a story that is sort of one of those foundational stories of oppression, and has been used over and over and over again to talk about women as seductress, why women can't be trusted to make decisions. So I'm really interested in sort of thinking about these big foundation blocks, particularly of our modern Western civilization, and thinking like, where are the other people that populated that landscape and that story, and then having fun with that as a way to challenge its authority and make way for new stories.
Yeah, I think all of, like, a mix of all of, I guess, the answers so far. So I'm going to cheat that way. I myself, I don't know what the definition is. I like listening to other people's definition. I know that. What I tend to do, and what I'm not sure of if what I'm doing is a feminist thing, is, like, who's the creator, who is in charge of interpreting that creation, and in the putting of the interpreting of the creation, what room and who built the freaking room. So if I can answer truthfully and authentically that, who the people that have certain powers that are making the art, and those three for me are kind of the main ingredients, then yeah, like, that's often what who I look to when I'm trying to put a label on something or trying to identify something. So if it is written by a production is being put on, and it's by a woman playwright or woman identified playwright, by a director, a female identifying director with a mostly female creative team that is led by a company with, like, a female identifying artistic director, like, do you know what I mean? Like, so there's the structures from, like, the macro to the micro, then I feel like we're doing our jobs right. That's it feels right. It feels nice and feels good, and so I'm going by those. I don't know what to call that, but those are the kinds of rooms that I love creating or making, or producing or nurturing or making space for. At least I attempt.
Thank you. I want to follow up on that, Nina, because you've brought our attention to kind of these broader structures of power in theater. And I'm thinking about, studies about equity, gender equity in theater, but also about diversifying theater that say, you can make a real difference if you change, if you diversify who the people who are in those top positions of power in theater. And that would start with the artistic director, and that might have a trickle down effect. And I think in the last 10 years in Canadian theater, I am seeing kind of a shift. We're starting to see more BIPOC folks in those leadership positions, more women in those leadership positions. So I'm wondering if the panel can talk about what it means to have women in those positions of power. And also, maybe picking up on what Pol Pelletier was talking about, is there a feminine style of leadership? Would anyone like to comment on that role of artistic director? Maybe Kelly or Nina, if you have thoughts as the artistic directors in the room.
Yeah, I think I only know my own experience. I only know the rooms that I've ever led. But I think I'm a pretty collaborative person. I think about leading from the center, a very non-hierarchical, very collaborative way to make decisions, like that. I'm not out in the room dictating the room. Really, as a director, I feel like I'm in there working to bring what everyone's bringing into a cohesive whole. And I feel that that's kind of the same in as an artistic director in an organization, that I've spent my time as a leader really trying to bring the best out in everybody else, and kind of, it's not been the Kelly show. And I don't know whether that's a feminist approach. That's just my personal approach, is I really I feel uncomfortable in terms of hierarchical structures. But I do think, the impact of who's leading an organization and the the change of leadership across the country is having a huge impact and will continue to have a huge impact on what we see on our stages. What Erin said about, I think you said, where are the other people? You're talking about narratives, right? You're talking about plays, but I think of Atwood writing the Penelope ad, that the maids there was a couple of lines about the maids in the Odyssey, and then they were all killed, sorry about that. And Atwood dug down on that and gave them voice. And I think, so that question of where are the other people it has to be a constant question in terms of, as we're leading organizations, it has to be a constant question of, who's not having a voice here, whose story is not being told, because that's the most important story to tell. And that's how we broaden Canadian theater, and broaden theater generally as a sector.
And I think too, just to add, being a playwright who works at lots of different theaters, it's just, you just feel a bit more like relaxed when you don't feel like you're the only female playwright who's in the season, or you like, I have a very passionate open letter to the board of Soul Pepper from about 5 years ago, when their season announcement was basically like 15 dudes and 1 woman playwright. I'm talking just about playwrights now. And I was like, are you kidding me? This will never, ever, ever be a place where I can find a home, or probably have my work seen or be selected. And now Wayne Mangesha is killing it there. And, looking at, I didn't even know what the rest of her season was, but sort of seeing how much space she has made within a very short period of time for women, BIPOC artists, like just being very, very open. It for me as a creator, coming to work and be in that space and create, it feels it feels safe, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like personally a big part of that, when it comes to having a feminist space and artistic creative style for a theater organization, is it empowers women, genderqueer people as a group, so that it doesn't feel like everyone has to shoulder the entire burden on their own. I think that is so key and so crucial, and that does, I feel, it encourages inclusion, and it reduces, alienation and solitude. It's just really, I think, powerful when people are able to come together as a group, and it encourages us.
Yeah, I again, lovely answers across the board. I just keep going back to, yes, it's one thing to kind of ask the question of like, whose voices are there, whose voices are not being heard, whose stories are not being told, and invite them to your space. But even now, like as I'm growing into my career, I'm also questioning, like, where am I inviting them to? Again, who is setting up the room? Because who made the invites? Who made the menu, like, to the party, and who am I, who can I pass on the power to, right? So for me, if it's inviting perspectives, it is also inviting the power to interpret works. And that also means reimagining classics. What Erin is doing, that means kind of, being subversive, like, turning, well-known classics on its side. And, because like that to me is a beautiful, powerful way of reclaiming something, or asking us, the audience, the community, to look at another perspective of the same thing. And but also, again, from the ground up, like, you know, what seeds are we planting, and whose voices are, you know, so, but that to me will always include the room, like who is leading the room, and who is generally in charge of creating the room to be led. And yeah.
This kind of I think segues into a question I had that's also a bit inspired by Pol Pellitier's remarks. So, as a radical feminist artist, she has always intentionally positioned herself on the margins rather than aim for mainstream success. So when we recorded her manifesto, we asked her about what her greatest wish was for the future of feminist theater, and she said poverty. Meaning that she thinks feminist theater should happen at a really grassroots level outside of traditional funding structures and institutions, that it shouldn't have to worry about marketing and publicity, these kinds of things. So I wondered if the panel can talk about these two different approaches for feminist artists. So on the one hand, doing work that is maybe radical, very grassroots, versus work that speaks to more traditional models of theater and seeks mainstream success. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I have a few. I think feminist theater should happen everywhere. I think it should definitely happen in grassroots, and like the most radical, outrageous things should happen. I also am really interested in making stuff for large stages and getting into spaces where we can talk to larger groups of people. I think specifically, like at the moment, I've been working on a prequel to Shakespeare's King Lear, and I've been thinking so much about Shakespeare, and Shakespeare has got to be, I don't have stats on this, but has got to be the most produced playwright in the English language everywhere. And he was writing at a time when women weren't even allowed to perform on stage. So that means there's 3 female characters to every 15 male characters. That means that if people don't, mess around with the casting, this is the entry point for teenagers who, read this stuff in high school and then go to the Stratford Festival or Bard on the Beach or, Dream in Hyde Park or wherever they go. And this is their introduction to theater. And in many ways it's brilliant. And in other ways, it's just this weird version of the world. So, I think I think feminist theater has to exist I think we've got to break in to the mainstream and, invite them in. Part of the thing I'm interested in too is like, I'll give you a name that so the name King Lear, so you're going to be like, oh yeah, maybe I'll go see that. Maybe a larger audience who doesn't see a lot of theater. And then once they're in their seats, you can go deeper and go further and go, Nina, I think you have done that. You did it brilliantly with your season where you programmed all of these sort of Canadian classics and then subverted the expectation of the bodies and the voices and the people, an audience might assume to be on that stage. And that is so I found that to be so powerful and subversive and spoke to an audience who would come to the theater. Yeah. Sorry, I get very worked up.
No. I also think like there's space for everything. I don't think it's an either or. I think we need warriors at all levels, both in the grassroots indie to the mainstream to the highest of the highest. Why the hell not? There is space for everything. I don't think it's binary and that like we can only. What I will take from that, however, is a scarcity mentality. I think like there's nothing like hunger to drive us, right? To move us forward. And that I never want to be comfortable. I never want to feel settled. I want to keep, being curious. I want to keep investigating fiercely. So if that means kind of having that, the scarcity attitude of like, there must be more, like, then yeah, I fully 100% agree. Like, that we mentioned status quo and the disrupting of that, because status quo is no longer good enough for us, right? Like us wanting more, us wanting to be better, like we should always have that at the pit of our tummies. And once we get comfortable, that's it, game over. And so I think for me, if there's, to be hungry all the time, for knowledge, to listen to, then I'm all for being able to kind of nurture that mentality, hopefully for the rest of my life.
Alex, you're nodding. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah. A lot of what's being said so far really resonates with me. And I feel like also kind of to offer my perspective as, I'm not a huge fan of the term, but as ostensibly an emerging artist, I have a lot of thoughts in this myself. And I think that personally, the concept of being on the cusp of the mainstream is something that resonates a lot with me personally, and like what I like to do personally with art and creation. But like has been said, I do not think it's an either or black and white. And when it comes to the mainstream, I 100% agree that it's so important to never settle or rest on your laurels. You always have to be moving forward, always questioning everything you're doing. But I think that, like has been said, the mainstream is a tool. And I think that something that is really key to me, crucial to me, that really excites me is the concept of reclamation. Like, I really like the idea of, I think it's essential that you look towards the past, because through the past is how you understand what's going on now and what may happen in the future. That's something that always really drives me in my work. And I also think that a good comparison, if I may make a lot of music comparisons, is like hip hop, jazz, funk, where these are all grassroots, Black, African American art forms that were, in the grassroots initially, and they've become more mainstream now. And there is that risk that, of things, becoming co-opted by the mainstream or becoming co-opted by hegemony. But that doesn't mean that radical forms of these arts, or their fundamental radicalness to begin with, that doesn't prevent it from existing. There's still plenty of radical forms of music out there in these genres, and they aren't erased by the fact that they have a little more prominence in the mainstream. And if anything, the mainstream can be used as a tool to draw people in and have them become more aware of these grassroots and guerrilla and much more socially conscious and critical attitudes. That's a little bit of where I'm coming from personally.
Thank you, Alex. You've given me a great segue that I need to take to a question I have for Kelly, which might seem long-winded, but we're going to see the connection, I promise. So Nightwood Theatre, I think, is one of Canada's longest running feminist theatre companies, but it didn't start out that way when it was founded in 1979. And it has used that label, I think, in various ways and to different extents throughout its history. So Kelly, as the longest serving artistic director of Nightwood, you were AD from 2001 to 2019. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to publicly embrace the label of feminist as a theater company, and how public attitudes towards Nightwood's feminist identity and Nightwood's work shifted during your tenure as AD?
Yeah, I was thinking about that this afternoon, preparing for this panel. I'm thinking, wow, when I took over in 2001, I was, I grew up with Ms. Magazine. My sister was, the oldest. I was the youngest. I was like naturally kind of just immersed in that, born in the 60s. And but when I took over of Nightwood, I was really fixated on the fact that young women, teenagers, were like, well, yeah, but I'm not a feminist, and really against the label. And I started a program called Busting Out, literally to teach young women that it was okay to identify under that label, and that if you believe in these values, then guess what? You're a feminist. And now I think things have radically changed, but that's the backlash that was still reverberating in 2001. I've said this story before, but a journalist asked me, what's the point of a feminist theater company in the 21st century? Aren't we beyond that? And so there was this facade when I took over that, at that time, Marty Meriden was running the National Arts Center and Jackie Maxwell had taken over the Shaw. And so there was like some big institutions that were being led by women. And I was like, it's kind of like the forest facade along the Trans-Canada Highway. You think Canada's got this beautiful forest throughout Canada, but in fact, there's a clear cut about a kilometer behind it. So that's where I started to drill down on 20 years after, in 2002, 20 years after the Rena Fraticelli report. What is the point? What are our numbers? And so I embraced and promoted the label of a feminist theater. But you're right, and Nightwood did not start as that. It was four women, four kind of punky women making collective creation, and they became branded as the women's theater. Four guys get together and it's just theater, and four women get together and it's women's theater. But Mary Bingo, who was running Groundswell, no, she created Groundswell. She was running the Rhubarb Festival with and there was opportunity for women's voices to be heard and not enough space. And so Nightwood, I think, grew up from being a collective creation, centered on their own personal work, to a place that became space for women's voices to develop. And as Alex said, like safety, I think you mentioned safety is super important. So, and it as the movement grows and progresses, that space continues to grow. And I remember when talking about the question before, I remember when I first was interviewed by the board of directors, I was like, Nightwood needs to take up more space. We need to take up more space and grow this company so that we can support more people. And it grew a lot during the time that I was there, but still is, rubbing $3.50 together compared to where I am now. So I agree with Erin, and with everybody that said that, feminist theater needs to be everywhere. It needs to be in large spaces. It needs to be in community halls. It needs to be everywhere, because that's part of the kind of the changing narrative. We have to be able to have a platform that can be heard.
Maybe this might lead to a good question for Nina. If we talk about feminist theater having to be everywhere, you're the incoming AD of the National Arts Center English Theater. You're also the president of the PACT Board of Directors. So in those spaces that don't necessarily have an explicitly feminist mandate, what does it mean to kind of come into those spaces with kind of prioritizing your feminist politics within
now those institutions will have those things in their mandates. I mean, not necessarily mandates, but because mandates don't change, it's my interpretation of that mandate, right? That will have, through my lens of who I am, right? A Filipina Canadian short woman. I will interpret those mandates with all of who I am, and that makes up my identity, and it's multifaceted, right? So and if to me, I will always ask, and I don't know if I have feminist pop, maybe I do. I will always say, like, look to the work, right? And so for folks who have been following the kinds of works that I have been doing, that I have led, that I have been part of, that I have, then the expectation of what I bring into the NAC is going to be no different. I just got to be me in that regard, and I wear my priorities on in my heart, and I'm very transparent about it. I'm very unapologetic of what I am looking for first, not that I'm looking only, and those are the very big differences, right? It's not exclusionary, it's actually inclusive. Like, if there's a word of like an inclusionary, invent a word. It's just there's priorities, and for me, I will always go to the voices that need to be amplified the most first, and then everything else falls naturally into place. Everybody will have their chance, but it's like, I can't do everything all at once, but I can do everything what little at a time, with the artists that I carry on my back, and the artists that I will also encounter and discover along the way and learn from.
Thank you. Alex, I'm going to ask you a question about your process. You're currently creating a piece called Dreams that incorporates poetry, spoken word, and music design through a collaborative process and a polyvocal view. So in Canada, feminist theater has a real history, a kind of collective creation from the 70s, 80s. So is this kind of approach that you're taking inherently more feminist? And what are the benefits, do you find, of working this way?
Yeah, I think so personally, because a big part of why I love this approach is it just comes naturally out of who I am, and it just comes naturally out of the people that I know, the people around me. Like, I feel very lucky and privileged that I just know so many other amazing women, and I'm really good friends with, and there's just so much just love and joy in the air, where it's like, it's just a natural component that when I want to be creating something, I want to include the other people who have brought so much into my life. I want to try and make it a reflection not only of myself, but all the people around me. And so that's why this approach just kind of came naturally. It's just me knowing, oh, I know this person, she's really cool, and she has such a great voice for poetry. I would love to ask if you want to be a part of it. Or I know someone who's really great at music, sound design, lighting design. It's just like, yeah, you'd be an amazing choice, and I would love to have your voice as part of the project. And it's just cool to me how it all puts together. And really, almost the way that I think of it when I'm creating is, it's like a mosaic. Everything that I'm creating and doing is a reflection of everything that it took to bring me to this point in time. And that's why I consider it important for my work to reflect that. And yeah, it's just the emphasis on community and the emphasis on sisterhood and support and safety and the power of doing things, collectively as a whole. Yeah, I find that that's a very feminist approach. It's a very queer approach. It reflects my status as being like biracial too, and it's just like, it's a very natural reflection and mirror of who I am and the fact that the world I live in, the people around me, are all part of a wonderful mosaic.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Erin a question, and then I'm going to ask a question to the panel. So kind of riffing off what you're talking about, Alex, working collectively, then I think of Erin's work. And Erin, a lot of your plays are kind of solo written. I've heard you talk about your very disciplined writing process before. So I wondered if you could talk about, how you build community as a feminist playwright who's often kind of starting out just typing away on your own, and where community kind of factors into your process, how you find it.
Absolutely. I leave lots of space in my scripts. So because I, like you, Alex, I love creating with people. And sometimes that is more from an inception point of view, but more and more, yes, I'm the sort of the first person. But for example, in the adaptation of Jane Eyre I'm working on right now, it's like, I feel like there's a lot of movement in this play, and I'm not exactly sure how it works. So I just have movement piece. Maybe these kinds of things happen. Or I'll write lyrics to a song, but I don't have the song, I haven't written the song. And so, I try to do very few stage directions to sort of leave lots of space for the director and the actors and all the other people who are playing. And then in those particularly in that first chunk of rehearsal or during workshops, it's so amazing to have other people in the room contributing and challenging. I love to be challenged in all the ways. So yeah, I'm always pushing to have lots of different voices in the room to be able to push and pull and grapple with this thing together.
Thank you. I'm gonna ask the panel a question in a moment, and I'll just also take this opportunity to remind everyone that you can put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we're gonna start the audience questions shortly. So a question I had for the panel is, all of us on this panel have been involved in advocating for gender equity in theater, whether through creative work or advocacy efforts. So in these discussions, a question that often comes up is, what is the role of men in achieving gender equity in theater? How can they best support this movement? So any thoughts on that question? Nina, go ahead. Or sorry, you unmuted yourself, so I thought you wanted to go.
You can go, Kelly. You're the one.
Okay.
I just unmuted for convenience.
Yeah.
Just in case I forget.
Yeah. I think, number one, I think, it's not, I think feminists come in all shapes and sizes. And so I think men can be feminists. I think there are many, many, many men that are feminists, and they have to be part of the change. They have to be, I think, aware. But if they truly believe in their hearts, they are also trying to disrupt. There's many, many, interesting artistic leaders that are male that are also trying to disrupt the narrative. So I think, I think it's funny. So much of the work that was done in terms of doing the statistical analysis, or like sending Rebecca Burton into exploring the numbers across the country, and a lot of those early days, there was a lot of like shocking kind of wildfire conversations. One at the PAC conference in 2006 that I sadly I was directing. It was right after Rebecca had like finished her report. She brought it to PACT, and PACT was like, I will not be told what to program. I have the freedom to program what I feel. And that would never happen now. I don't think that. I think people would, be led out of the room. But there were a lot of, in those early days of that study, there was a lot of, I think, men that just actually had no idea when they were programming that they were not including all the voices at the table, and were kind of shocked and horrified that they didn't program a more balanced playbill. So I think you got to keep that conversation alive. I think we watched numbers kind of go up around 2012. They were like, oh, we're gonna, and then they went down again. So I think the conversation around inclusion has to be at the forefront of everyone's mind when they're programming, and that includes male artistic directors. But I think there's many allies. It's, as I said, it's a broad movement advocating for equality. So, yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other thoughts on that? Or okay, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, if I could say a couple things. I mean, I think that really the fundamental thing is men and feminism are on the same team. I think that it's important to remember that men benefit from feminism as well. And it's also so important to remember that, feminism is intersectional. So there's also, trans men and BIPOC men, and it's so important to remember that as well. But I think that really, with regards to men and contributing to feminism, the important and fundamental part is simply respect. Like, there's listening and making sure that it's not, intrusive, because a key part of the thing is space. And it's entirely possible to be on the same page, but also just respect the importance of space and what that means. I mean, I think that it's often very easy. What I've personally seen is it's very easy for men to get defensive when the topics about feminism are brought up, because no, it's not about men as an individual being complicit in this, but feminism is about looking out at the world and looking at where we are in a part of it, and just kind of questioning and thinking about it. Like, we always have to be like, why is it the way that this is? I think that having that open-mindedness and willing to respect and engage and listen when issues are brought up, and take the most reasonable precautions that you can in those situations. Just always be working on yourself and be mindful of the space around you, and it's just about other people. That's really what it is, I think.
Yeah, I think, Nina, go ahead.
Yes to all of that, but also I think, whenever I'm asked this question, like, what can men do? And I'm like, well, get out of the way. If you are going to make me the leader, then really make me the leader. Like, give me the whole car, not just the steering wheel, right? And hop on to the back, and I'll ask for your opinion when I need it. Don't assume that I will. Don't assume that I'll need your mentorship. Let me drive, and let me drive the way I have my driver's license. I passed the same test as you did. So don't tell me how to drive the damn car. I will drive it the way I want it to, and just enjoy the ride. And, if I'm too tired to change the tires, then change the flat tire. Like, help when I can. And so I think for me, it's just about, like, let us lead, and really give it to us, and not the fake kind. So sometimes the best thing that men can do is, like, for reals, make space, get out. Great.
Oh my God, Nina, everybody loves that. Like, everybody's getting crazy in the chat.
You're getting a lot of clap emojis. Okay, so I think, that on that note of that mic drop moment, let's move to some audience questions. We have time for a few before we wrap. So the first question says, no question, we have all come from a patriarchal capitalist narrative. So what is the new narrative? Any examples of the new narrative from Canadian playwrights? And I might also add to this, is there anyone's work who our panelists are really excited about when you're thinking about that new narrative and what the future is? of Canadian theater and of feminist theater.
I will just start by saying I think I'm very excited about the students that I work with at the National Theatre School, and I'm not just saying that because I saw one of them in the chat, but I feel like the work that I've seen that young people are making, and not just young women, but young men, young trans people. There's such a hunger for specificity and clarity and respect that they're really striving for. So I'm really excited. I'm excited about that.
Any other thoughts on this one?
I kind of talked a little bit about my own personal perspective on it previously, like the importance of polyvocality and community. But one thing that kind of occurred to me that I'm kind of would like to throw out there is, does there need to necessarily be one singular view of what the new narrative is? When I think that part of the importance of what we're talking about with feminism and structural change is I feel like it's kind of important to kind of just liberate ourselves from feeling like there has to be one singular way of doing it. I think that having that sense of, community and multiple people's voices and multiple ways of doing things, that's personally what I think is an interesting thought.
For me, I like new narratives happen all the time. I think what I'm most looking forward to is the acceptance of those new narratives, because where I actually find resistance is still, where we're still in the areas that need updating, like severe updates, like in criticism, for example. I know in the works that I do, and especially in, the BIPOC creations, we're still having a hard time breaking out of that box, of this is what a Filipino Canadian play should be, or a Korean Canadian play should be. And every time we kind of edge out or smash whatever the expectation of what our works can be, in form, in convention, in narrative style, whatever, it just throws everybody, including some audiences, for a loop. And so I dream of a time where, forward facing kind of ways of delivering stories, because I think there's never a shortage of amazing content there. It's just now it's how we deliver that in so many ways, multiple ways, including virtual, now that we've discovered in the pandemic, is kind of just having loving ears and open hearts, and kind of going, okay, that's that, let's learn from that, let's and allowing a multitude of critical thinking and critical analysis of those works, because that's really how we are going to keep inventing and reinventing and redefining different kinds of forms and structures, feminist or what have you, by getting rid of this notion of what is the perfect polished Canadian play, and like with Alex said, is what is that? Can we have all of it, and embrace all of that, as opposed to start pitting each form and each work against each other. So it really is for me about kind of the reception of these narratives that are coming out, to not be shackled by audience expectations, is something I'm really looking forward to.
I'm just going to reference Calpurnia because it's in rehearsal right now at MTC, and it's a collision. It's a collision course. It's a comic collision of a whole bunch of people trying to make sense of their world from all different perspectives. And there's something about the messiness. I think good theater should be messy and uncomfortable and kind of knock you off your pins. And that brings new perspectives. And that's the kind of theater that I'm interested in putting on stage.
Thank you. Thank you all for your answers to that question. There's a question from Lisa Marie Di Liberto in the chat. Lisa says, I'm curious about the panelists' thoughts on how feminism intersects with caregiving, especially in the context of performing arts where many women have had to drop out due to lack of support. So any thoughts on that question of caregiving?
Yeah, so many. It's so so many. Yeah, it's just such it's such journey. You know, I moved to Quebec. I was living in Toronto until my children were 2 and 4 when I moved to Montreal from Toronto. And in Toronto, I had to like fight for a daycare subsidy. I had to go and cry at the office, and I had to use all of my like playwrighty acting skills to manage to pay like still $1,000 a month for 2 kids in daycare. And it was so stressful. And I had so many conversations with women in all fields of life, all walks of life, who were debating whether or not to quit their jobs because the cost of daycare was as much as money as they were making in their jobs. When I moved to Quebec, I had 0 conversations about that. The daycare I got for my daughter ended up being, it was the most expensive one, and it was $30 a day. And now there's an after school program integrated into the school systems here. And I just see like such a huge difference that childcare makes in the lives of every single caregiver. And, you know, let's be honest, it really does still mostly end up being on the shoulders of the women. And there's lots of different, you know, I think artists can be very creative with how they can help one another deal with that. But I still don't think it's been solved in our industry. And some theaters are trying to go down to a 5-day week, but then where do you like, great, but then you lose days of work. So you know, and when my children were young, you know, like Callie, I was working at Nightwood, and Nightwood was incredibly accommodating in every way. So I definitely had like fantastic experiences, but I've also had like really, really awful experiences that really made me feel like I couldn't take advantage of the opportunities of my male counterparts, and that that was going to leave me behind somehow. It was a very real fear that I had until I moved to Quebec.
I will say that you know, there's a, like, you're right, Erin, it's it's still a work in progress here in Canada. And really, fundamentally, like, our processes of creation, so to speak, you know, is still led by a very, very male created document. Um, so that's why rehearsals are structured the way they are, right? Like, you know, with no kind of thought or care for women at all. So I will just say that, you know, that is something for sure at Pact, for example, where you know, we are working towards trying to, you know, if there is a way to, you know, have a way to introduce a multitude again of rehearsal processes that can not only accommodate, but like, put in the fabric of the creation families, mothers, single mothers, children, you know, whatever that is, you know, at the forefront, and modify and adapt, you know, rehearsal in that way. And that means maybe there's a week off, like, do you know what I mean? Like, so so being able to kind of really like create a bespoke rehearsal process that is, you know, custom tailored to the players, to the creative team in the room, that really is for me the end game. And what I'm like, what we're all ultimately trying to fight for. But of course, there are like, you know, you're working on dinosaur, right? And so getting like the ice to even shift one side, like you need the whole entire thing. So it is a beast, and it's a big undertaking, but we got to start it. But that is the conversation, definitely. That is, you know, in the forefront. And sometimes it's 10 steps forward and sometimes it's 5 steps back, but you know, like that is definitely, I will say, a priority in the fight, for sure. Because again, for some reason, you know, I came in to this in our theater community already, like with the CTA and the ITA and all of that stuff, like in place. I don't know who once upon a time, like I only get the stories of like how those documents were created, but it definitely didn't have me in mind. And so there are rules and laws in there that I'm like, well, it's very obvious that it's for dudes that, you know, don't have periods and, you know, don't have families or don't need to worry about families. But are also, you know, from speaking from, you know, their own center of their universes, right? And not so much, again, who can be the potential players or leaders in the room. So that's something that I think is worth fighting for and worth changing.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we're reaching the end of our time together. I feel like this conversation could go on for many more hours, and we have so many great questions in the chat. So I just want to take a moment to thank Alex, Nina, Erin, and Kelly for joining us this evening and taking part in this really inspiring, I think, and stimulating discussion. So thank you so much. You can put your emoji claps in the chat for our panelists. So we are going to end this evening with some words from Eda Holmes, Artistic Director of the Centaur Theatre, about the feminist playwriting of Eleanor Siminovitch, and in particular, her experience of discovering and mounting a reading of Eleanor's play, Big X, Little Y. Eleanor's writing career spanned 1962 to 1994 and included over 30 plays with 12 productions and readings in Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal. Her themes included feminism and sexual stereotyping as illustrated in Big X, Little Y, which won the Ottawa Little Theatre's playwriting competition.
So my name is Eda Holmes. I'm the Artistic and Executive Director at Centaur Theatre in Montreal, Tiohtià:ke, Quebec. Eleanor was a very engaged playwright and writer. So Big X Little Y was a very bold theatrical experiment around gender roles. And she took the idea of, she used nursery rhymes and fairy tales to tell the story of a man and a woman meeting, falling in love, getting married, and what that would be as a normal thing. But inside of that, she embedded this unbelievably powerful commentary on how women's roles were eventually subsumed and reduced and destroyed by the will to power of men in society. So it was funny. It's very funny. It's very smart. It's extremely adventurous and experimental in the way that she mixes form inside of it. And it was a blast, actually, to work on. You know, what's kind of wonderful in the title, Big X, Little Y, is this idea that we're sort of chromosomally designed, you know, that we are a set of chromosomes that define our gender. And the play seems a bit like a series of experiments challenging that notion, or revealing the narrowness of that notion. compared to what a real person is like versus these sort of cartoons of what people are like, which is the way the play treats those relationships a little bit.
That's so.
The protagonist of the play is named Laurie, and at the end of the play, she's been sort of, if I remember this correctly, kind of corralled into a small circle, and she finishes as the world kind of just gets smaller and smaller and smaller around her. The last words of the play are, "I dreamt I was a barrel sitting in the middle of the road. And as each person walked by, he kicked me. And I bounced back and forth, and whispered, 'Thank you, thank you.'" It just almost makes me cry. I remember actually in the reading, it was quite moving after all the kind of bold hilarity of it, that this little, this character who'd been so thrilling in a way, being reduced like that was really, really tough, actually. It's a very interesting conversation that we're engaged in right now, especially as the world shifts to the awareness that gender is not necessarily binary, but we really have, at least my generation of men and women were raised in this idea that men were one way and women were another way. And men were good at these things and women were supposed to be good at these other things. And they were separate and they would never, ever come together. And the world got structured economically that way too. I think the pandemic has really taught us that the unpaid labor of women has been really keeping the world running for a long time. And so as everybody's been forced to stay home and then double their duty, the women's duty became triple in the course of the pandemic, especially people with children. So, and I think what's different though is I think there's a generation of young men who actually are awake to the disparity and are looking for a different future from it. I think that where in the play, what she was talking about was that men were unaware of that. Like they weren't able to even understand what that was. I think it's kind of, at the show, when I was at Shaw with Jackie and we started to try to kind of look for the voices of women from the mandate, the 1850, the old mandate, the 1856 to 1950 mandate, which was sort of Shaw's lifetime. It was always unbelievably thrilling and heartbreaking to find these plays that nobody heard of and nobody taken the time to follow up, and nobody had taken the time to, even some of them had been, success. Gita Sowerby had a really successful career, but it hadn't been nurtured the way some of the other more known playwrights had. There were also men that got forgotten too, St. John Hankin and that, but someone like Eleanor Siminovitch, who had such an articulate voice, to have not gone on and not been writing more. I don't know that there are more. I don't know if they know. I don't know about any other of her plays. I'm sure there are some, but the fact that we don't even know, and is sad to me, that there's an experience. There's a set of stories missing that we have as empowered women of today. We have a certain responsibility, I think, to speak out and unearth again.
So I want to thank Eda for that, and thank each of you who joined us this evening. It was so lovely. I think a lot of us recognize a lot of the names in the participants list. So I'd love to ask our audience to drop in the chat anything that stood out to you in the discussion that you wanted to share. Your comments will then be shared with the panelists after the event. The Saminovich Foundation is a Canadian charity that relies on a community of donors who believe in supporting artistic risk-taking. We thank all of our donors, and in particular, those donors who made tonight's conversation possible. the Kingfisher Foundation, Tricon Residential, and the McLean Smiths Family Foundation. Thanks again for spending your time with us this evening, and we hope to see you again at our next Siminovitch Forum in May. Happy International Women's Day.